Baroda Beartuck. We're looking forward to an exciting day's program. I'd first like to start out by thanking our sponsors here at the Z Literature Festival. Our sponsors who've helped us keep us this legacy over 13 years. Z, title partner. Nexa, associate partner and venue partner, Front Lawn. Bank of Baroda. Motwani Jadeja Foundation. Rajasthan Tourism, the JCB Prize for Literature Festival Bookstore, which houses all the books featured in our sessions during the festival. Aga Khan Foundation, our series partner, Rekit Benkisser. Diageo, Air Asia, our travel partner. Kingfisher, Red FM, Launchora, Facebook, Be Live, UFO Movies, our Cinemedia partner. Save the Children, helping with our book launches. Pratham Books, outreach partner. Our series partners, the North India Office, US Embassy New Delhi, Mahindra World City Jaipur, session partners, British Council, Netflix, Etsy, Public Health Engineering Department, United Nations of India, Avid Learning, Murthy Classical Library of India of Harvard University Press, Australian High Commission and Australia Council for the Arts, Paris Buildtech, Sahitya Academy, Center for Policy Research, media partners, Dainik Bhaskar, Rajasthan Patrika, Amar Ujala, Business Standard, Inox, Matrabhumi, Outlook Magazine, the New Indian Express, the Tribune, Jan Mikalski, Zomato, DLF, Penguin Random House, Jayashree Periwal International School, Citibank, Storytel, CK Birla Hospital, LIC, Sotheby's, SBI, John L. Bissell Foundation, JW Marriott, Airtel, Karma Kettle, Grover Zampa, Coca-Cola, Gulmahal Lane, Hotel Dickey Palace, Taj Rambagh Palace, Clark's Amer, also hosting our musical extravaganzas, Royal Opera House Mumbai, The Lalit, Full Circle, Yuva Ekta Foundation, who will be staging a special performance tomorrow, Royal Treasure, Event Board, Edelman, Social Connect, McCain, Unibic, Wagbakri Tea, Mustkin, Kanha Sweets, and Be Life. Our first session today is titled Uninhabitable Earth, discussing the climate crisis of our only planet. Our conversationalists, David Wallace Wells, Marcus Mensch, Navroz K. Dubash, in conversation with Prem Jha. Would you all join me with a big round of applause in welcoming our guest speakers to the guest?
Microphone. Give me just one moment. I give up. I give up on these, quite honestly. Where is it? Folks, I don't know how to work my own computer. I'm going to have to introduce everyone. I'm going to have to introduce everyone extempore. Let me start with David and David Wallace Wells, as you know, has written Our Uninhabitable Earth, which is the subject of our conference today. I mean, the title of this session. And he's done something that needed to be done, and I think only one other person has even tried to do it, is Naomi Klein, really, which is to say, look, there are all kinds of uncertainties about the predictions on climate change, but let's not look at the uncertainties. Let's look at what's the track has been so far and what the track is likely to be, and drop all the whys and wherefores and tell us where the world is going. And it's a frightening picture. He did this 18 months ago in an article in the New York Magazine, which went viral. 17 scientists, not all of them climate scientists, by the way, said this is not realistic. He's not done his research. And I can tell you something. In just these last 18 months, a great deal of that sort of skepticism has gone, because 3 months after he did that, the IPCC's special report on 1.5 degrees centigrade came out, and that confirmed pretty much most of what David said is likely to happen in the future. We're going to ask him to start with telling us in substance what he fears. We have Navroz Dubash, who is the head of the Environment and its Climate Change section of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi. He has just produced his second book. It's an edited book called India in a Warming World. It's available in hardcover. It's also an open access book, I want you to know. Any of you can go on the net and look at the essays, and whatever you find is of interest to you, go ahead and please read it. We have Marcus, how do you pronounce it? Marcus Mensch. Marcus has lived 12 years in India, but he now lives in Boulder, and he is basically he will talk. He's an expert on all the issues of adaptation. How do we deal with the warming world in the years that come, even if we find ways of arresting the rise and reversing the rise in CO2 concentrations? And then I'm your moderator. I've done some work in this area, and I have also a book out somewhere. It's out there if you want to have a look at it. I'll pop in from time to time and say a few things, but as they strike me. So, David, may I ask you to kick off our session?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thank you all for sharing the stage with me. It's great to be here with each of you, and thank you all for coming to talk about this. Many people, when they try to imagine the threat of climate change, find themselves imagining the future, some distant threats. But I think it's often useful to think about the present tense, because, or at least to start by thinking about the present tense, because we are all already living in quite unprecedented times. The planet is about 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution today, which doesn't sound like very much, but it puts us entirely outside the window of temperatures that enclose all of human history, which means that the planet has never been as warm as it is today when there were humans around to walk on it. And that means that everything that we've ever known as a species, the development of agriculture, the development of the human animal, the development of civilization, everything we know about ourselves as political creatures and cultural creatures and emotional creatures, all of that is the result of climate conditions which we have already entirely and permanently left behind. It's like we've landed on a new planet with a new climate, and we now have to figure out what of the civilization or civilizations that we've brought with us to that new planet can survive those new conditions, what will have to be renovated and reformed, and what will have to be discarded. And that's just at 1.1 degrees, which is where we are today. Scientists say if we globally immediately stopped emitting carbon today, didn't produce a single ounce more, we're producing about 37 billion tons of it every year. But if we didn't produce a single ounce more, we'd probably be due for about a half a degree more of warming just from what's in the atmosphere today, which would put us about 1.5, 1.6 degrees, maybe even 1.7. But of course, given all the political, economic, and cultural obstacles to real action, I think it's impractical to expect that we could find ourselves south of 2 degrees. And 2 degrees Celsius is a level of warming that scientists call catastrophic. It's a level of warming that many island nations call genocide, and they have good reason to. The UN says that at 2 degrees of warming, damages from storms and sea level rise could grow 100-fold, that cities in South Asia, in India, the Middle East, could become so hot during summer that you wouldn't be able to walk around outside during heat waves without risking heat stroke or possibly death. These are cities that today hold 10 or 12 or 15 million people in them, and it could be the case that just in the second half of this century, every year in each of them, tens of thousands of people would be dying just from the effects of direct heat. Scientists expect, again, just at 2 degrees of warming, perhaps 150 million additional people would die from the effects of air pollution. And we'd probably be locking in just north of 2 degrees, maybe 2.1 or a little warmer than that, the permanent loss of the planet's ice sheets, which would take centuries to unfold, but over time would produce probably 80 meters of sea level rise, which is enough to drown 2/3 of the world's major cities and maybe 80% of them. And that's 2 degrees, which is practically speaking, I think, a best case scenario. Things could get somewhat considerably worse from there, depending on the choices we make today. But just walking through those impacts gives you a sense that this is not a threat that we can really think of as distant in time or place. It is truly all-encompassing. It affects economic production, it affects cognition, it affects mental health, public health. Nearly every aspect of modern life will be transformed by this force, which is to say almost all of them will be damaged by it. And while those damages are expected to arrive unequally, with the nations in the developing world being hit harder, despite the fact that they've done considerably less to bring us to this point, and the nations of the wealthy West being hit relatively less hard, nevertheless, you will not be able to escape this force or live in a way that is not defined by it, I think, no matter where you live on the planet. But of course, some places are going to be hit harder than others, and unfortunately, India is expected to be the absolute hardest hit. And I think Navraz is going to talk a little bit more about that in detail, but it's just as a conceptual matter, a framing matter, I think really helpful to keep in mind. India is expected to withstand as much as a quarter of all global climate damages in the rest of this century, considerably more than Bangladesh, which is threatened to be largely, if not entirely, underwater over the rest of the century, depending on how sea level rise goes, and much more than Australia, which, as we've seen over the last few months, is already staring down some incredibly dramatic climate impacts with wildfires, not just a wildfire season lasting 3 months, they've literally had fires burning now for 3 months at a time, and those fires are going to continue to burn probably for another 2 months, burning 20 million acres, 20 times or more what California has dealt with in its worst wildfire seasons, killing more than 1 billion animals and forcing the evacuation of tens of thousands of people in scenes reminiscent of warfare and total social disarray. Now, how far the rest of the world gets into futures that seem to be predicted by the experience of Australia, I think is very much worth keeping in mind. It's about the choices we make today, because climate change is not it's not distant in time in the same way that it's not distant in place. We often think that this is a problem that has been left to us by our ancestors, that it's a story of centuries, and it's fallen to us to clean up the mess left by our grandparents so that our grandchildren will be living relatively well off. But in fact, half of all of the emissions that have ever been produced in the entire history of humanity from the burning of fossil fuels have come in just the last 30 years. And that's since Al Gore published his first book on warming. It's since the UN established the IPCC climate change body. We've done more damage since then than in all of the centuries, indeed all of the millennia of human history that came before. And that means that we've also done more damage knowingly than we ever managed in ignorance, which is quite distressing considering at the moment we're placing a lot of hope on the fact that the world is finally waking up to this threat. The recent past suggests that awareness, consciousness of the problem is far from sufficient motivation to produce outcomes and response of the kind that we would really need to avoid some truly terrifying outcomes. I'm 37 years old, which means that my life contains this entire story. When I was born, the planet's climate seemed stable. Scientists worried about the medium-term and the long-term threats from climate change, but at the moment, things seemed okay. And now, just a few decades later, we're on the brink of catastrophe because of what has happened in those last 30 years. This is not a problem that our ancestors left for us. It is the work of a single generation, which is to say, the work of the generation of everyone in this room today. And because most of us are going to be alive for a few decades more at least, we're probably going to be able to see the next act of this story too. Scientists say, if we've done the bulk of this damage in the last 30 years, we now have about that much time to take action to avoid truly catastrophic outcomes. And the next few decades will be absolutely critical, which means that all of us are alive today at an absolutely consequential hinge point, not just for climate history, but for human and planetary history. We're living through what's called a mass extinction right now. It's the 6th mass extinction in human history. Four of the other five were produced by greenhouse gas effects like the ones that we're living through today. And we're today adding carbon to the atmosphere at a rate that's at least 10 times faster than the fastest of those extinctions, the worst of which killed at least 90 and perhaps 97% of all life on Earth. Now, I think humans are an adaptable, resilient species, which is another thing that we'll be talking about later in this panel. I think we will find ways to live amidst these transformations and this suffering, but adapting to what level of human pain and climate cruelty is very much an open question. And I think if we find ourselves living in a world defined by unprecedented human suffering, even the incredible resiliency and adaptiveness of the human species won't be sufficient to allow us to build lives for ourselves that look or would look to us today prosperous and livable and just. If we want to secure those promises and that future for ourselves, we must take dramatic action today, both on the decarbonization side to make sure that the impacts that we're living through and adapting to are smaller, and also very aggressively in how we try to build new infrastructures and social structures that will allow us to live in flourishing ways everywhere on the planet, not just in the wealthy corners of the world, in the face of some of these quite dramatic transformations, which, just to close, I should say, not just a matter of extreme weather, not just a matter of sea level rise. I think one of the most important things for the public to start to understand in a way that hasn't been all that well understood anywhere in the world is that these transformations are dramatic enough that they will shake the foundations of every aspect of modern life. It's not just about escaping the shoreline. It's not just a matter of protecting yourself from drought. It's a matter of the way that our politics and our geopolitics, our culture, our relationship to economics, capitalism, our sense of our place in nature, and our sense of the shape of history, how all of these things will be transformed in the decades ahead, inevitably, no matter what we do. But we have an opportunity to make sure that they are changed in ways that give us a future that is, again, relatively livable, relatively prosperous, relatively just, and ultimately that is about what we do today and in the next couple of decades, which means the responsibility is shared by all of us alive today, indeed shared by all of us on this panel and in this room. We must take action soon on all fronts to give ourselves a chance of the kind of future that we would like to leave to not just our children and our grandchildren, but even ourselves in old age. So with that, I think that's a good big picture start of, yeah.
Thank you, David. I strongly urge you to read every page of the book. I should tell you something. whatever the scientists may have said, 40% of the wordage in this book is references and footnotes. It is one of the most carefully researched books on this issue that I have come across. So please go ahead and do it. I now want to pass this on to Navroz. Navroz, we've had some rather dramatic events which have brought home that we are not immune from climate change in the last few years. And finally, the Indian Meteorological Office agreed and formally said that we are being affected by climate change. Would you like to tell us some more about it? Oh, by the way, this is India in a Warming World, open access, but also in a beautifully produced hardcover copy, and hopefully in the future in paperback. But don't wait for the paperback.
No, indeed. Please go ahead and just download the book. The intent is to stimulate engagement. Thank you very much, Prem, and thank you, David, for that really thoughtful sort of tour of your book, which I really enjoyed reading a great deal. I think David is absolutely right. What we are seeing already, climate change is already here. Many of us who've worked on this for a while, Marcus and I go back actually to grad school where we used to talk about these things, so we've been at this for a fair bit. But I think very few of us have predicted the pace and the scale of the changes that we are already seeing. Now, one of the artifacts of climate change science is that a lot of the work that is done tends to be done in areas where the research funding is, where the resources are, where the academic capabilities are. And so ironically, there's less research on climate change impacts in India, which is very vulnerable, than many other parts of the world. But there is enough that we can see what is going on. So let me just give you embellish what David said with a few sort of examples. Let's take, as David said, we're already at 1 degree. We're headed towards 3 degrees if we don't do anything differently. Already with 1 degree, it's expected that irrigation needs in a country like India will go up 10%. We're already a water-scarce society. So these are ripple effects. If we have 10% more demand in irrigation, it's going to ripple through our economy. Demands for water in urban areas are also going to go up. So that is an example of the kinds of things that we'll have to deal with. We are already dealing with a situation where we have a jobs crisis in India. With climate change, labor productivity is expected to go down. All the science suggests that the productivity of our labor will decline. One way of dealing with that is air conditioning the place, which of course only exacerbates the problem. Let's take another example of our cities. There was recently a study, finally a climate change study that made it to the front page of our newspapers, which showed that most of South Bombay will be underwater in 2050 if sea level rise proceeds as anticipated. The bottom line is that while India has long argued that development is our primary priority, we no longer have the luxury of thinking about development in a world that is innocent of climate change. We have to think about development in the context of a warming world, and hence the title of the book. So this is a much more complicated challenge. We're not doing a great job dealing with our development under the existing conditions. We're going to be dealing with development under an even more complicated set of conditions, where we will see warming, we'll see frequent disruptions, we'll see many more violent weather events, we'll see a decline of species. We're already seeing fisheries impacted, for example, by climate change. So this is the context that we are going to step into. I just want to take a minute, though, to say, okay, we've all, I certainly on this panel, I suspect many of the people in this room agree that we need to do something about this. The catch-22, the dilemma I face, is that agreeing that we need to do something doesn't necessarily tell us how we act. And one of the tensions I feel when I read books like David's is that, yes, pressing the alarm bell is really important. It has led to the sorts of mobilizations we've seen in Europe around Extinction Rebellion. It has led to some important legislative changes in countries like the UK. At the same time, that sort of story of alarm also induces paralysis both at the level of citizens and at the level of policymakers. It seems like a giant problem to address. And you fall back into a long tradition in India and other countries of saying, well, look, we didn't cause much of this problem, somebody else did. So we need to really just safeguard ourselves, but rely on somebody else to solve the problem, which tends to break down in north-south lines. And so I've seen a little bit of that happen in the last few years, even as the alarm and the awareness grows, so has the defensive pushback that says, okay, this is not really a problem of our making, it's deeply unfair that we should have to deal with it. What's the way past this? I think we actually need to have multiple narratives in the climate debate. One is the narrative David laid out, which is that climate change is here and now. It's a giant problem. It's moving towards the scale of an existential problem for humanity. And if we don't do something about it, we will be in a situation where development aspirations will be much harder to achieve. But the reality of it is we need another story. I don't think that story, from my experience engaging with policy and the public in India, I don't think that story by itself will tell us how to act. And we need another story that says, how do we manage to meet our development needs while also transitioning to a low-carbon future? It's a slightly more hopeful story of opportunity. India hasn't built most of its infrastructure. India hasn't actually completed building most of its cities. We have no idea how we're going to provide jobs to the millions of people who are now moving from rural areas to urban areas. We have a chance to rethink all those things through a low-carbon lens. And if we do that well, it will also give us competitive opportunities in the future because the world is moving to a low-carbon economy. So we need to find a way for our policymakers, for our business, to also tell a story that breaks this giant climate problem into a few more tractable problems. What kind of cities do we want to build? Right now, we're building cities around roads and the private car. That is simply untenable. We need to have a public transport-based system. What sorts of infrastructure do we want to build that is resilient to coastal surges? Do we want to make sure that we stay away from coastal areas for key infrastructure? These are challenges we can take on. Air pollution. India has the worst air pollution in the world by some distance. The air pollution problem is not the same as the climate problem, but there are a lot of overlaps. There are a lot of things that will both solve air pollution and climate change. That is a more tractable problem. So I think we need to have sort of in our minds the sense of urgency that David talked about, but we have to be really cautious that it doesn't result in a diplomatic and a kind of north-south global blame game backlash, and instead we break it down into more discrete problems that we have a chance of solving, that we have some control over addressing: air pollution, urban transport, and so on. So,
thank you. Yes, now may I just a couple of points about how India is being affected. In the last 4 years, 5 years now, we've had 3 deluges, floods in Tamil Nadu, and 2 terrifying deluges in Kerala, which have killed thousands of people, destroyed tens of thousands of homes, and flooded entire cities. We never had this before, not in 100 years, not in living memory. And it's not accidental. It's happening because of 2 things. One, there's a 50-year trend, and there's a study which shows that the monsoon winds are weakening for various reasons. One of the reasons is that as the seas grow warmer, the amount of evaporation from the sea is increasing. Our southwest monsoons, therefore, are heavier with water, and therefore they move more slowly. One result is that when they hit the mountains of the Kerala coast and they rise into cooler air, there's more water to drop, and that's where the floods are coming from. And it's dramatic because it's happening so suddenly and now so frequently. It's like as if we've crossed a tipping point. If you look on the other side, exactly the same thing's happening. You've got the northeast monsoons, which come from China, from Asia, but across the Bay of Bengal, picking up water. And the Bay of Bengal, I think, is about 2 degrees warmer than it was, say, 2 decades ago. So there's much more evaporation being picked up and being, again, dropped much sooner because the clouds are heavier. One result is that if more of the water has been dropped earlier, there's less when you go inland. So India has just emerged last July from a 10-month drought in the whole of South India, which absolutely devastated people. There were children carrying buckets, catching trains on the side, practically stopping them, going to the nearest station, filling up at the tap, and catching another station, coming back to the village to meet the drinking water needs of their families every single day for months. That's how bad things have become. And this is not accidental. The entire process is understood, And the only way you can stop this is in the long run, not in the short run. I'm going to talk, I think we have Marcus Mensch, who's done so much work on adaptation, on water, on groundwater, and all kinds of things. He's written, by the way, 6 articles in the Economic and Political Weekly over the last 16 years, 18 years on these issues, which you can look up on the net. They're open access to. Marcus, over to you.
Okay, well, now I have the joy of talking on the adaptation side, and the thing that I always think with the air pollution example is, it's lucky that people live in Delhi because they can walk on air, and the point on that, though, is that I don't think societies move where they see the light, or politicians or leaders, they move where they feel the heat. And so something that cuts across boundaries, that cuts across political groups, et cetera, is imperative. And that's what we're beginning to see in Australia, in other areas. And I see that as a positive step, where people start feeling it, and that is where you begin to get the real pressure and the potential for a different narrative to arise. I'm working right now on things that I call the butterfly wing. Where do you enter in complex systems to catalyze change? And when I look at the climate problems, I tend to think in terms of solution spaces and problem spaces. Solution spaces are those areas where we have all sorts of things, we know what to do, it's just the question of getting the social mobilization to do them. And I think in the water arena, we have tons of things like that. We have tons of things like that in urban design. We have tons of things like that in transport. We have an amazing amount of that in emerging technologies around energy. And there's real opportunities there for new livelihoods. When I look in my own country, I'm tending to wear black these days, and I'm going to wear black most of the time, at least until we have serious movement at our political level on climate. So that's, it's not a random piece. But I look in North Texas, and you can't touch the windmills. That's a politically red state. But the reason you can't touch the windmills, and they've grown, is because you're a small rancher, you put 10 windmills on your farm, your ranch, that's $50,000 in royalties a year, and it's jobs. So all of a sudden, it's flipped the economic equation. So there's a real push, despite Texas being very conservative and the center of the petrochemical industry, there's a real movement. It keeps the Dairy Queens open, is what people say. It's what keeps the small towns alive. So I do think there are real solution spaces. And this is where the idea of the butterfly wing, how do people identify those openings? Where can you push? But I also think that your story is incredibly true. The problem spaces. And when I look at North India, we did work with NCAR a couple of years ago that looked at heat specifically and looked at the less sexy part of heat, the minimum night temperature. And that's what really scares me, actually, because the minimum ambient heat index across the Gangetic Basin, where about 500,000 people live, 500 million, my brain is just off by an order of magnitude. But that is increasing, and it's likely that you will have a minimum night temperature that doesn't go below a heat index about 36, 37 quite soon for about 3 months a year, and particularly during the monsoon. It's when it's high humidity, and providing active cooling, how do you do that across that? Tremendously energy intensive, and that's forgetting about crops, that's forgetting about livestock, et cetera. So I think that point illustrates one of the problems is we have a lot of solutions, but we also have areas where we need tremendous innovation, where we need real thinking. We need to think about how people move, where they live, et cetera. And it's going to be in places where we don't expect it. The rising sea levels, I go to Bangkok and I think about that. I describe it as an upwardly mobile city, and that's because everybody's moving to the second floor. They're moving all their equipment up. And it actually makes a significant difference. But that question of how do we avoid the political directional chaos that would be there if you had displacement of population across the Gangetic Basin, the identity chaos. And I think that applies as well in the West. Yes, India may well have some of the biggest impacts, but I think we'll be very surprised at home as well. So to me, the question is, really not changing just the development trajectory, but the question of how do we achieve a much deeper change, which is really about how we live, how our footprint is, what we aspire to. You know, the climate impact of every decision we make are actually not insignificant. And that's why, coming back to Navroz's point on narratives, that's why I'm here at the Literature Festival, because I actually find inspiration heavily in the literature. How do cities survive? What have people done in the past? The stories that are told. And that, to me, is where we can connect the areas that we know there are solutions with the areas where we don't have answers and come up with better ways of addressing them. Move people, and move them at an emotive and identity level, as well as a technical level. Deborah Roberts, who's a good friend and is head of IPCC Working Group 2 co-author, and I used to joke that a lot of the development dialogue around climate was completely disingenuous. It was like putting rubber stoppers on the deck chairs of the Titanic so you didn't scratch the deck going down. And so it's shifting that from that minimum stuff to a really much deeper rethinking.
And I would just say, especially thinking about the question of development and narrative, that thankfully there has been a real sea change in the way that development economics views this question. A decade ago, it really did seem that a country like India did have to choose between developing rapidly or developing responsibly. And most economists would now tell you quite candidly that they see that dilemma as having disappeared, or at least it's less of a naked trade-off than it used to seem, and that in many cases the opportunities for faster growth lie on more responsible paths. Now we need to engineer a politics and a culture that focuses on those opportunities and delivers those kinds of transitions. But it's not just, we're not selling snake oil to say we should be living on renewable power. In fact, it is a boom opportunity all across the developing world, and perhaps nowhere as strikingly as here in India.
Is this working? Can you hear me? Yeah, we now will move from what should be done and what needs to be done to what is actually being done and what can be done. And I want to first of all start with by joining with Navroz in saying that simply saying that we are headed for doom, unfortunately, has been having the opposite reaction of saying, if that is so, then I don't want to think about it. There have been a number of studies in the US. There was one in particular in 5 centers in the US with 200 respondents in each, and given 3 ways of they were approached about the climate change problem in 3 different ways. One was the gloom and doom scenario. One was, well, I mean, it's pretty bad, but can you think of some ways it could be fixed? And the third was, well, there are lots of solutions. If we put these in, then we will be able to deal with it. And the third approach found the highest proportion of people accepting that climate change is a problem. And more studies like this are being done now, so we will see this. I think we need to move on now from this to saying what can be done. And I want to, take some of the time that John Lanchester would have had, who tragically has developed a very bad stomach trouble. He's a novelist. He's written 5 great novels, and 2 of them particularly are hilariously funny, and they're very good. And they are related to the world we are in today, particularly the world of climate change, and they are available in the bookstore. The most recent one is The Wall. I urge you to go and read it. I mean, it's good to read about climate change also from the side of perspectives of novelists, because they often see what we do not see. Having said that, let me just add a few words about how to approach this. What is actually happening? The scientists and people are not sitting still. First and foremost, 2 forms of renewable energy have become far cheaper than electricity, which is wind and solar photovoltaic. All of you know that, and the development in this is very, very rapid. The question that is now there is, particularly with wind power, it's now being established that there is enough wind power in the world, if you just take it in gross terms, to meet all our needs for quite some time in the future. But the problem is, it comes at different times and in different places, and is also not totally predictable. That solar photovoltaic, of course, is only during the daytime and only when there are no clouds. So the big issue today is not whether we have alternatives to fossil fuels for energy, for electrical energy, but how you marry them. And I can assure you there are several solutions, and the ones that are being worked on now are cost-free, and they will be in place in a few years. And please keep a close eye on that. That's one part of it. The other side of it, of course, is that we have all the issues that Navroz raised, which is in the developing countries, we're mainly still agricultural. We are still in the middle stages of developing, into urban societies. Do we really need to go the whole way? It's quite clear now that we don't need to, because agriculture can be the base of the transport fuels and a great part of the industrial raw material base that we need, which is today being met from fossil fuels. I'm going to stop talking about that there because I'd like them to talk. But now we have 25 minutes in which I think we've got a good 10 minutes to discuss your ideas and solutions and so on, and 15 minutes, please, for all of you. May I just pass it on? Who would like to start on this?
Maybe I can pick up.
Would you? Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Prem. So I think well, let me step back for a second. I've been part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for a while, and the narrative in that body, which is really meant to be kind of the scientific statement of consensus among scholars and scientists working on this, focuses on the climate science, but there's a group that looks at solutions. And most of what they talk about is that the potential exists for a world that delivers development, progress, sufficient energy needs in a way that is also low carbon. The key word there is potential. So the technical potential exists. We can, in other words, there's a point somewhere out there that is better than where we are now. The real difficulty is in getting from where we are now to that point. And the challenge really is that we are locked into the current ways of doing things by a set of political interests, by our institutional structures, and by our behavioral patterns. Let's start with the simplest, right, which is behavioral patterns. We're locked into certain patterns of food consumption. I was on a panel on something called the Anthropocene, the fact that humanity is now shaping the world at geological scales, and one of my colleagues was telling me that at the moment, there are 21 billion chickens alive on the planet, and we go through some 60 billion chickens. There are more chickens than all other mammals put together on the planet. It's kind of an astonishing number. So we are locked, and that is a very energy-intensive agricultural system. We're locked into that, and at root, it's the sum total of all of our behaviors. So we have to shift our behaviors. That takes time. Shifting politics takes time, right? So Mr. Trump, I might have to share your dress style, Marcus, in the near future. Mr. Trump says he's going to save Appalachian coal miners, right? There are strong interests around the coal industry. There are strong interests around the oil industry. It takes a while to shake them loose, despite the fact that the economics is so much stronger. And finally, the institutions. So in India, climate change is under the Ministry of Environment, Forests, and Climate Change. Yeah, we need to close? Okay. We're not going to deal with the kind of integrated issues if it's only sitting under the Ministry of Environment. We have to find ways of bringing lots of other power centers into the conversation. So it's that pathway that we have to focus on is the point I'd like to leave you with.
I just want to take a minute just to say a few words in defense of alarmism. Because, in part because of the issues that you're raising, we have patterns of behavior that are very deep and which are enforced by very powerful interests, different interests all around the world, but everywhere you look, systems that are producing the climate problem are among the most powerful interests in those particular countries. And I think that's one reason why it's important for us to understand the scale and scope and urgency of the crisis, because if we hope to address this while essentially continuing to live as we do, and trust those who say, oh, the solutions can be marginal and they can be imposed without much transition, I think we're going to end up making not nearly the changes that we need to make. And my own perspective is, I'm somebody who woke up to this issue out of fear. So I think that there is value in using that language and that narrative to talk about climate change. I certainly don't think it's the only way to talk about the issue. I think it's far too big a challenge to talk about in any one way. But when I look at the political and public awakening on climate all around the world, although maybe most concentrated in the West and the US over the last few years, I see an awakening that was produced by a series of hair-raising, alarmist reports and events. So the 1.5 degree report, which was produced by the UN in October of 2018, was much more forthright and, to my mind, clear-headed and transparent about just what was necessary. They said the world needed to mobilize at the scale, parts of it mobilized in advance of World War II globally, and that in order to have a chance of avoiding catastrophic warming, they said that mobilization needed to start last year, 2019. And the year that followed that report was the year in which we saw Greta Thunberg arrive on the international scene, Extinction Rebellion rise up. And we're starting to see commitments from certain countries around the world. They're just pledges and we can't trust them, but they're much more dramatic and engaged on this issue than has ever been the case before. And I think that a rising sense of immediate alarm is a part of that. Now, we don't want to fall into fatalism and despair, absolutely. But of course, for me anyway, it's the flip side of the panic button is that when you talk about the scale of the changes that are possible, they are ultimately a reflection of the power that we have over this climate. They will only come to pass if we make particular choices that take us in that direction. And ultimately, they can tell us that if we take different choices, we will find ourselves in a different world. We need to sort of keep both of these things in mind at once: the scale and urgency of what we're facing, and the fact that the story is not yet written. In fact, we are its authors and writing its next acts every day.
So very quickly, I agree. I've been working on climate now for 38 years, from when I first did it. And I've been on many panels of this nature. And a comment comes to mind that I tested yesterday and or the day before yesterday, that was very illustrative. Deborah Roberts said to me once, what will climate responses be like when women are in charge? It was a question of different approaches. And I was at one of the outreach sessions with the school, with high schoolers yesterday, and I asked the boys what to do. All of them talked technology. I asked the girls what to do separately. All of them talked organization, change, stories, that sort of thing. And so there was a tremendously sort of powerful piece. We've seen an awful lot of talk about options, technologies, approaches, and yet it doesn't resonate with at least half of society. So I think that that's a key piece. And 38 years of almost all male dialogue on stage.
Here, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to open up the hall for questions. One small comment on what just passed. There's one universal solvent for changing institutions and structures, embedded structures of power and functioning. And that universal solvent is profit. And today it is becoming highly profitable to go into renewable energy. And that is going to, the faster that takes place, the quicker will the structures themselves change. By the way, this is a purely Marxist approach. You can go back 150 years, you'll find the same thing is true. Folks, please, now. Oh my God. Look, what I'm going to do is, I'm going to start from here. Please make your questions short and, we'll get. I'll start at the back there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, then we'll go this side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Now, the gentleman in the corner, yeah.
Thank you. My quick question relates to the Sustainable Development Goals. Some critics have sort of called it an oxymoron, and they've promoted the idea of degrowth and worldviews that come from indigenous communities and others. So it'd be nice to know the sort of panel's reflections and thoughts on those sort of conversations.
Shall I do one thing? Maybe take I said 5 questions here, do note them. Let's ask them in groups of 3 or 5. Second person, yes. There was someone here, yes? Please go ahead.
Should I go?
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much for the panel. I'm so grateful. I am hoping I'm not starting a leftist conversation with this question, but I feel like we are lacking a conversation about capitalism in this talk when we talk about how climate change came to existence, and especially the north-south axis, which is still so riddled in exploitation, which is based on capitalist exploitation. And I would love to hear what you guys think about that, and how you see solutions in that kind of space as well.
Here, there's a hand here. Oh, okay. Look, don't raise any more hands, please. Those who had their hands up in the beginning, I'll have to go through you first. Okay,
Hi.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm a science writer. I'm a journalist and I write about science. I actually worked for NASA in the early 2000s with Jim Hansen and Drew Shindell and Gavin Schmidt. And so I've done a little research on climate psychology and talking not about the doom like someone mentioned, but actually about the solutions. I wondered if you have suggestions for, as a science writer, what kinds of stories to tell that might break through and have a little bit of impact on the public.
Okay, I'm going to stop here and ask you to make a few comments.
So
and then we carry on.
The first two are really related questions. Can we hope to develop in a way that's sustainable? And can capitalism survive if we have a hope of the planet surviving? For me, I think certainly the system of financial capitalism, extractive capitalism that most of the world has been living under now for, depending on which country you're in, a few decades or a few centuries, can't continue. We have to have really significant renovation and reform. But I also think that some of those reforms are actually in the direction of truer capitalism. The IMF, which is no friend of the left, says that globally we're subsidizing the fossil fuel business to the tune of $5.3 trillion a year. Now that's not, it's a little bit of a misleading stat because some of those subsidies, only a fraction of those subsidies are direct. The rest reflect the fact that our carbon price doesn't include environmental costs. But if you are imagining the world withdrawing those subsidies and even just withdrawing them and not doing anything with them, that's actually creating a freer market, which would actually be pushing us closer towards a renewable future. And it would be moving even faster if you push that money towards investment in renewable deployment. I think that I think that we have yet to figure out.
You have to make it short.
Yeah, the big questions are very hard to know the answer to at this point. But it's also the case that wealth has, especially on the adaptation side, is extremely valuable in helping protect people. And so for me at least, I'm not ready to embrace a true degrowth approach because I think that would be depriving much of the world of many of the tools that will be most important in protecting future generations. But we have to get growth that is healthy and equitable and just, not the kind of growth that we've had over the last few decades.
I want to answer the capitalism question, if you don't mind, very briefly. Look, what you're talking about is industrial capitalism. Capitalism existed for 400 years before fossil fuels came. Industrial capitalism of today is the product of fossil fuels. When fossil fuels are replaced by renewable energy, the shape of capitalism itself will change. And it will change because of the profit motive. We will go back to a different structure which will not be so heavily urban-oriented. I won't say anything more than that. Think about it. More questions, please.
Just on the stories question, I would say write whatever story you want to tell. There are a million stories to tell out there. We shouldn't think that there's only one way to talk about this issue. There are 8 billion people on the planet. Each one of them has a different perspective on the story, and it deserves to be told.
Please, in front. We go in the reverse. First, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm sorry, we'll run out of time. Would you please start? Yes. No, sorry. Here, in front, please. Start. Yeah. Yes.
I think this is a question for David. I've got some brothers-in-law who are climate change deniers, and I'm interested in finding a readable, authoritative treatise or whatever, so that I can become better informed to respond to their arguments. Can you tell me where I should go?
For me, the best treatise is the extreme weather that we're seeing that every day on the news. I think that it's one major reason why climate denial is actually in retreat in most parts of the world, even in the US, which is one of the strongest bastions of it. Depending on how you ask the question, 70 to 80% of Americans believe climate change is real and concerning, which means only 20 to 30% don't, which is roughly the number of people who believe that we live on a planet with aliens. So we don't need to focus, I think, as much on the problem of climate denial as we do on the problem of climate complacency, which is that many people who are concerned about this issue aren't concerned enough, and many of those people in power are not focused on addressing it at nearly the scale that it demands. But any single treatise, I mean, I think my book does a pretty good job. I think the writing of the people on this panel does a pretty good job of that. But ultimately, the best counter-argument is the changes that we're seeing every day in our weather systems and our natural disasters.
Thank you.
There, and then there two more, and then please ask your questions, and if there's any specific person you want to address them to, please do.
Good morning. This question goes to all of you. I think given the situation that you describe, it's safe to say, or you would agree, that a lot of these solutions are going to come from the generation that's currently in school. We have to solve these problems on a very short timetable. And I have the humbling honor of working on designing school and curriculum programs, actually work here in Delhi NCR. Recently, a student said something to me about Indian education is very provocative. He said, with all the emphasis on personal success and year 12 marks, what's that going to matter if Delhi's on fire and India is no longer can sustain society? So my question for you is, what's your advice to educators? What type of changes do we need to make in the way in which we teach children and we prepare them to face and solve these problems, the school-age child now, so that they are well-equipped, not just for personal success, but to address these problems and create the kinds of solutions that you're calling for in a very short time period?
One more question, then we're going to come back to the panel. We've got only one question more. I'm sorry. The gentleman who has a hand up here.
There's a lady right by. There's a woman right next to him. Where do we go?
Yes, all right. Why don't you take yes, go on. Thank you, Navroz.
I really love the talk that all of you presented. I just have one question. So as all of you can see, many people are using solar energy that I think is going to help the environment. So what do you think, that is it helping the changes that climate change is making and all the dangers? Is it preventing it, or is it playing a pivotal role in the dangers of climate change?
Solar power?
What was the last word you said? Say that last sentence again.
So, yeah, is it helping the damages that climate change is making, or is it not helping what is happening right now around us?
Okay, so solar power at the moment in India is 20% of our electricity capacity and generates 10% of our electricity. The hope is that it'll really grow in the future. But I think your question ties to the previous question, which is, what do we do? How do we, what do we say to educators? How do we start thinking about this? And I would say that, and solar is a good example of that. I would say that the most important thing is to have an education system that frees up kids to imagine different futures. That we don't have to live in the way that we've lived in the past. Because if we live in the past, if we rely on 21 billion chickens, if we rely on cars to transport ourselves, if we rely on centralized power plants instead of solar panels on our roofs, if we don't adjust our lifestyles, if we don't adjust our voting behaviors, and envision entirely different ways, including ways that challenge the sort of logic of capitalism, we really are sunk. We need the step changes that David talked about. We need sort of an entirely, a dramatic shift. I personally believe that dramatic shift has to work through national political systems. At the end of the day, climate's a global problem that is going to be solved by the sum total of national politics. And so in national system after national system and local system after local system, we have to reimagine our lives and our economic systems. And that's what our school system to teach us how to do.
One last minute, I'm going to ask Marcus to comment. And then I'm really sorry, we're going to run out of time, but I'd like to give the last word to Marcus Bench. And we'll be outside. Please talk to us there. I'm delighted that so many people want to ask questions. JLF, please note more sessions on climate change in future years.
My quick question really goes to that question of psychology. There have been previous societies, the First Nations in the US and Canada, the Native Americans, which are not about accumulation of goods, which challenge the question of capitalism, but are still very much rooted in historical behaviors. I mean, there are societies of that type. And the question our kids are asking, and the kids ask me often, is how do I use less? And our kids are in part of a whole movement that is actually consuming less. They don't want as much furniture. They don't want as much of other things. And I think that question of psychology, how do we flip the psychology, and where can we get the inspiration, is perhaps one of the most profound ones, because that will challenge our economic system, it'll shift our politics, and that is a lot to do about who is part of the dialogue, who isn't part of the dialogue, and what's accepted as possible. So that's my...
Thank you, everybody.
We'd like to thank our panel for this program presented by Center for Policy Research, and also as a mark of respect and honor, we'd like to present festival scarves to all our panelists. That's Navroj, David, Marcus, and Prem. The panelists of this eye-opening discussion would be available at the book signing tent that's to your left after you exit this venue. Navroj, David, and Prem have generously agreed to take out time to sign books.
Where are you guys from? Delhi. We are from Delhi as well.
Thank you, Prem.
To Binoy, Rajasthan seemed a bit like this.